My name is Paul Malloy, and I'm an alcoholic. Let me just briefly mention what we're going to be covering in today's general session. Initially, we're going to start off with Dr. Gitlow giving us his Addiction 101. Some of you may have seen it before, but if you have not, you're going to learn a whole lot and you're going to have a real treat, because this particular psychiatrist uses an old-fashioned way of flip charts and magic markers. And all of us can understand what is meant by that. I sometimes get lost in PowerPoint presentations. I sometimes get lost with texting and all that. But the nice thing about Dr. Gitlow is he keeps us in the here and now, and he makes us aware of the past. Because I remember when flip charts were the newest invention around. Now, the second thing we're going to do is, after Dr. Gitlow gives his presentation, we're going to learn who won the elections for World Council. Dr. Hoffman and Jane have spent hours counting those votes. I didn't realize that counting was such an intensive effort and labor until I observed them. What makes it difficult is that in the resident side, there were about 7 people campaigning for 3 jobs. And on the alumni side, there were 3 people competing for 1 job. It was easier to count the alumni, but when you start counting who gets the most votes for the residents, difficult job. And of course, the job is even made more difficult because at this successful convention, we had an awful lot of people, a lot of residents, a lot of alumni, and I hope you all had a good time. Now, even more important than you having a good time is that I hope you'll all go back home tomorrow and the next day and carry the message and be inspired to open a lot more Oxford houses. You all have every reason to be proud that there are 2,653 Oxford houses. Now, I know sometimes that we open them so fast, and so we sometimes put the celebrations behind a little bit. The state of Washington has been telling me all weekend that they're going to have a celebration next weekend for the 300th house in the state of Washington. Yes, the people of Washington state need a cheer, but you should also remind them that they need to keep track. There are now 311 houses in the state of Washington. I realize it's a big state, so it may take them a while to have the word spread, but next week, I think they celebrate 300th Oxford House. That's a good example for all of us. In the state of Washington has moved aggressively since 1988, really, to get Oxford houses in the far Northwest. We hope other states will do the same. The reason that Oxford houses work so well is that they follow the principles of democracy, which are built into our bone as folks in the United States. Very early on, we figured out that, people should have a right to vote. You decide issues by vote instead of fists and instead of fighting with each other. And we also decided very early on that you needed checks and balances, and you need to have some kind of format to stay within the guardrails. And Oxford House, from the very beginning, did that with the Oxford House Manual, the Chapter Manual, the World Council Manual. All of those things contribute to us running what I think is a very professional outfit. And being a professional outfit in and of itself isn't worth much. But being an outfit where every single individual is treated equally and every individual is given an equal chance to succeed at staying clean and sober. And every individual in Oxford House is able to get together once a year here for the annual convention, but most states now also have a state convention, and there are regional conventions, and there are chapter meetings. And as I have said from the beginning, the purpose of getting clean and sober is gaining self-reliance and self-respect. But it also is to make sure that we have fun. Life has to be worth living. Life has to be fun. If it's not, we go back to our old ways. But I think that this convention weekend has been fun, and it's going to continue to be fun. And for us to have both fun and education, let me now call on Dr. Gitlow to come and give a presentation on Addiction 101.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. I would love to tell you that my talk today will be exactly the same as it's been previously, but it's not. I'll include some of the highlights. I know some of you are looking forward to some of them. Some of those will be the same, but we've got to start out in a different place. Sex and drugs. Who thinks the two are related in some way? All right. And yet we're in a real different place now than we were if we go back 40, 50 years. So the lecture has to be different. You know, I'm 56. When I hit adolescence somewhere in the 70s, I remember discovering girls, and there was a place I could go to look at girls who weren't wearing any clothes. Playboy. That was it. There wasn't much to it. They had clothes on for the most part. And this was way before shaving was a thing. So if they didn't have clothes, you still didn't see very much. And that was it. And that was all there was until there was somebody real there. Well, that time has long passed. You know, somebody hits 13, 14, no matter what the parents are saying, no matter what kind of parental controls you think you have. You know, you all have been there. You know very well you find ways around that. And if you don't, your friends have. Right? So, and think about what's on Pornhub, YouPorn, XNXX, etc. Right? And it's not just a picture of somebody. Now we're getting into some things where we sit there and go, really? Why? But there's somebody out there watching those things saying, oh yeah, this is it, right? That guy turns into someone like Jeffrey Epstein. I don't know what happens next. But you sit there and you say to yourself, we're in a world right now where not only is the availability of this sort of thing way over the top, but what people do with it is way over the top. And that's what hits the news. That's the whole Me Too movement. It's the whole thing that says what was allowable in the past, even though it wasn't allowable back then, but we were ignoring it in the past, we're not going to ignore it anymore. But how can you be in a world where the two coexist, where we don't ignore it and we get people in trouble for it at the same time as we're exciting them with it? Right? You can't sit there and say, it's all well and good when it's imaginary, but it's not well and good when you do it for real. Well, the whole thing about sexuality is directly connected to drugs. Remember, again, if I go back the 40 years and I say, what drugs were available in my high school? All right, you could find THC with a 4% strength. That was about it. Right? There wasn't much more. There was no methamphetamine. There was certainly no powdered heroin of the strength and purity that would allow people to shoot up or snort. So people were staying away from it. Needles were the dividing line, right? So you wouldn't get a 15-year-old started on heroin because the drug wasn't available in the form. Well, just like sexuality has changed in terms of what's available to people, drugs have changed too. And what's available has changed. And so we can't expect people in their 20s, 30s, 40s to be in the same place that people were in when they were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s 30 years ago, because they grew up in a different environment. The world has changed and become so stressful, so severe, so in your face, over the top, whether it's social media driving it or the computers driving it or what. This is a different world, and the rules have to change alongside of that. You know, we can't go around doing what used to be okay. Sure, it was fine to, have criminal charges around heroin when the people using the heroin were the 1%, right, of those using drugs, and where that was sort of the high end and people, it wasn't everybody. Now it's everybody, right? How many people here have known somebody who died as a result of heroin use? Right? It's everybody. All of us are touched. And the wild thing about this is I could take an audience of people not in recovery, not actively using drugs. I could go to virtually any place, get an audience of this size, and say, how many of you know somebody who's been impacted by the heroin crisis? They would all raise their hands too. That's a change. Right? The world's a different place. And that's why yesterday we started to have some of the discussion around Suboxone and some of the discussion around medication-assisted treatment. And I said, just like these aren't your mom and dad's drugs anymore, this isn't your mom and dad's recovery anymore either. This is the sort of place where we've got to say the rules have to change. We have to do things differently than we did 5 years ago, let alone 40. Right, so we're looking at things a different way. How did this opioid crisis get started anyway? We talked about that very much. Right? Where did this come from? Came from a few different places if you want to go back a couple of decades, and essentially was a perfect storm. A number of issues came to bear simultaneously, all of which led to it. There's nobody to blame except everybody. Right? Because everybody had a role in it. But let's look at how that started. What are the different components of the opioid crisis? And how did we get to this point where we are now? First things first, is there an opioid crisis? Yes and no. Yes, in that you're all familiar with someone who's died as a result of it. But if I had asked you 20 years ago, how many of you are familiar with somebody who's died as a result of either cigarette smoking or tobacco? You'd all have raised your hands then too. So we had a crisis then. We have a crisis now. The crisis is addiction. All that's changed is which drug are we talking about? Right? We're still losing 500,000 people a year as a result of cigarette smoking. We're still losing 80,000 people a year as a result of alcohol. What has changed is the number with respect to opioid overdoses. That's changed. But the overall number, how many people die per year as a result of addictive disease, that really hasn't changed in a few decades. Right? So yes, there's a crisis, and no, there's not a crisis, depending on your perspective. But what about the opiates specifically? Where did that come from? Number one, Pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry came out with a new line of drugs. Different companies coming out with drugs that were long-acting. And the drugs that were long-acting were meant or were designed in such a way as to be less addictive. Well, let's talk about that for a second. What makes a drug addictive? A drug is more addictive typically when it is absorbed quickly, when it leads to a quick effect, an immediate and sudden change in how you feel, right? If you take a drug and you know it's going to work 4 hours from now, is that a drug you're really excited about? No. Although there's alcohol, that takes at least half an hour. There's no real way around that, but how many people have alcohol as their drug of first choice? A few, okay, but it's certainly not the majority anymore, right? Because most of you are looking for something that works more rapidly. All right, so the drug companies came out with these long-acting opiates that were meant not to be addictive. Of course, it didn't take long for somebody to realize you could crush it and snort it and get a lot more than you could with the shorter-acting drugs. But that wasn't the way they were designed, and that's not the way they were FDA approved. So suddenly, there was availability of this high-grade opioid that worked very well, that could be crushed, snorted, injected, and so forth. Doctors simultaneously were being told this isn't addictive. Who were they told that by? The pharmaceutical industry. All right, so the doctors are sitting there saying, all right, we now have this new opioid, and it's longer acting, less addictive. I can prescribe it to my people who have pain. But at that point in time, doctors knew, I don't want to prescribe a lot of opiates. Why? Because people can get addicted to them. And so they weren't prescribing a lot. But then something else changed. The Joint Commission, the group that certifies hospitals and other facilities, came through and said, we think it's very important, in order for your facility to get certification, that patients be satisfied. All right? Patient has to be happy when they leave your facility. So if a patient comes in and says, Doc, I'm having this terrible pain, the Vicodin works really well for it. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't give you Vicodin. Oh, I'm not satisfied. All right? Well, how about if I give you the Vicodin? Then I'm very satisfied. And they'd get the Vicodin. And they'd leave being very satisfied. And the hospital would get a gold star, right? And so would the doctor. And so the doctors came about learning, okay, I need to satisfy the patients. This is the only thing that seems to satisfy them. Whose fault is it at that point? Well, it's sort of the patients for coming in and demanding this drug that they really didn't need. It's the doctor for buying into this whole scheme that didn't make much sense. It's the pharmaceutical industry's fault for having this drug in the first place. It's everybody's fault. Everyone's participating in this so far. What else led to it? Well, the pain committees, the groups responsible for treatment of chronic pain, said to doctors, you're under-treating pain. Pain should be looked at as a vital sign. Take the blood pressure, take the person's pulse, find out their temperature, and ask them how much pain they have. So the doctor said, all right, we're under-treating pain. We need to treat pain more. What do we have to treat pain? Not very much. Never mind the fact that there's been no medical literature ever to say that opioids work as a treatment for chronic pain. Isn't that amazing, right? We're in the middle of the opioid crisis because pain was being overtreated with opiates, despite the fact that there's not a single article out there saying to doctors, you should prescribe opiates for pain. Not one. Opioids are meant to be used for cancer-related pain or acute pain, not for chronic, non-cancer-related pain, ever. Because 9 times out of 10, you'll end up with something called hyperalgesia, which means you will experience gradually increasing levels of pain, requiring greater and greater amounts of opioids to cope with, ultimately leading to the fact that you're taking these ridiculous doses of opioids, which you then need in order to feel better from the hyper-awareness of pain that you wouldn't have had if you had never been started on the opiate in the first place. All right. So the pain committees are telling the doctors you need to treat pain more. The pharmaceutical companies has made this drug readily available. The Joint Commission is telling the hospital to encourage the patients be satisfied. At about the same time as all of that happened, the federal government starts to close down pill mills. And when they close down pill mills, which is a fine thing, the patients end up sitting there who were getting ridiculously high doses of opiates to cope with the pain that they had as a result of having been on the opiates for such a long time. And they say, what do we do? Well, they would go to the street to buy opiates. And they would find plenty of opiates there, except the opiates came from the overprescribing largely from the pill mills, which were now being shut down. So just as the patients got out there on the street, their supply was cut off. And they said, well, can I go see the addiction doc and get detox? No, there aren't enough of us. And we had a limit. We could only give medication-assisted treatment, which works really well in these kind of situations, to a limited number of people. If we're going to have an epidemic of diabetes, do we go to the endocrinologists and say, you can only treat 30 people with diabetes? Are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. So we were sitting there as addiction docs with our hands tied. We could not treat the number of people who were suddenly on the street looking for opiates because their supply had been shut off. So we couldn't treat them. And they couldn't get the drugs on the street because that supply was being limited as well. At the same time, the United States became a net exporter of marijuana because we grow very good marijuana in the United States. We had been importing it from Mexico. Now we were not because our pot's better than their pot. So we send them our pot. Well, what do all the people who were sending us weed from Mexico going to use as their way of making money? Heroin, right? And the timing was perfect. They sent us pure, high-grade, powdered heroin that could be snorted or injected, right? So that kids could use it. Didn't have to be put in a needle. Could be used in other ways. And all these folks who were on the street as a result of all the aforementioned events now found themselves in a position where, oh, there's heroin available and it's cheap. You can make it even cheaper if you add fentanyl, but that's later. Right? So now all of a sudden, here's the drug, it's readily available, solves the problem momentarily, and that's where we're at right now. We are in a position that we made ourselves. Now, is there a way through this? Of course there is. We could start every single person who's been caught up in this on medication-assisted treatment for at least a short period of time, if not longer, but at least a short period of time to get them through the cravings, the withdrawal, and so forth, and then into recovery. And those who came at this because they had true addictive disease, they'll go through what all of you went through. Those who came at this because they were just misprescribed a drug, they'll find it easier. But either which way, they need to be treated. The percentage of people who need medication-assisted treatment for opioid-related disease is fewer than 10% of the population that needs it. The availability still isn't at the level it needs to be. So if we're going to address this crisis, we need to do so quickly and in a targeted manner and get it done and at least get us back to where we were to begin with, which was no great place. It was the place where 10 to 15% of the population has addictive disease. Part of this requires changing the paradigm of what is addictive disease, because too many people think that the paradigm is about drug use, right? When I talk about addictive disease, I am not talking about drug use, right? A lot of times people come in, they ask doctors, they give us surveys. And one of the surveys that I get pretty frequently is a survey that says, what percentage of your patients who use opiates are taking prescription opiates versus what percentage is taking heroin? And my result is, I don't know, and I don't care. It makes absolutely no difference. They're the same, right? One could be mixed with fentanyl, sure, but so you can crush the others and mix that with fentanyl too. I mean, they're the same. They do the same thing. The only reason why heroin is looked at any differently than all of the other full agonist opiates, all the other opiates that work the same way, it dates back to a law that was passed in the very early 20th century. It has nothing to do with science. There's no major difference between what's in Percocet or Vicodin and heroin. They work the same way. They do the same things. They'll get you in just as much trouble or not. So the differences don't really matter when you come right down to it. What does matter is what class of drug you're interested in using, and that matters from the perspective of how we're going to treat you. But truth be told, addictive disease is not about the drugs. Now here's where this argument keeps popping up. It's not an argument we'll hear often in a room like this. It is an argument you'll hear in rooms full of doctors. I'm a psychiatrist by training. Psychiatrists are trained that addictive disease is divided into different segments. There's a sedative use disorder, there's an alcohol use disorder, cocaine use disorder, and so forth. These are all, according to the psychiatry manual, different disease states. So it's really interesting, right? You can take a Valium, and if somebody is having difficulty where they're using Valium 30, 40, 50 milligrams a day, and they're diagnosed with a sedative use disorder, and then they stop using Valium and they switch to Budweiser, their sedative use disorder is now gone, right? Really? Their disease that they were diagnosed with is gone? Are you kidding? They're the same. They work the same way. So in the field of addiction medicine, which is another specialty, competing in some ways perhaps with psychiatry, in addiction medicine, there's one disease, addiction. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about Valium or alcohol or cocaine or opiates or sex, for that matter, or gambling. It's all the same thing. It's all based on the same thing. The outcome's the same. The rush the person feels, the desire to do something that the person knows will get him or her in trouble, the continued experience of acting out in a way that will make you feel great for the moment and then will dissipate and then will end up leaving you in harm's way, right? Because otherwise, I need to have some explanation as to how these diseases differ from one another. So I'm sitting around looking at an audience like this and saying, at some point, were you at a point in your life where you had lost all your money, your family, the people who cared about you, a car that worked, and your job? How many people were at that point, some point? Right? Right. So you lost everything that was important to you, right? And you sit there and you say, let me ask another question. Did any of you want that? Raise your hand if you wanted that. That's what you were looking for. Yeah, a couple, right? But for the most part, that wasn't what you were seeking, right? So, and yet, did you know, at least in the back of your mind, where it was taking you? You knew it was going there, but you couldn't stop, right? This isn't about a desire, but most people think this is a desire, where you have a choice. This has nothing to do with choice. I've always likened addictive disease and the use of something as being the same as if I take a group of individuals and lock them in a room with a banquet of food in front of them. And I say, I come in and I've got some rat poison and I spray the food. And I say, I've just sprayed this with rat poison. If you eat the food, you'll die pretty instantaneously. It'll be a horrible death. Don't eat the food. And then I leave, but I lock the doors. There will be a point, as time passes, where they're going to eat the food. Right? If I leave them in long enough, they'll eat the food. One of them will get up first and will come over and say, I think the spray missed over at this end. I'm going to start here. She takes the food, instantly passes out and dies. Right? And you say to yourself, well, now that it's been proven that if you eat the food and you die, no one else will eat the food. No. Second person's not far behind. Yeah. And of course, that makes sense because you get so hungry. The hunger drives you to do this thing you know is going to kill you. I look at folks who know where they've bought their drug from, and they've seen the urine drug test showing there's fentanyl mixed in, and they've seen that a friend who bought from the same place died as a result of it, still go back to the same place and buy it again. You've heard of that, right? That's the same thing. So if someone's willing to do that, there must be something driving them that goes beyond the ordinary. But it's not beyond the ordinary. It's exactly what a person locked in a room who's hungry will eventually do, except you're there at the beginning, right? I close the door and you immediately come up to the food. You don't even wait, right? What is it that makes addictive disease a disease where you won't wait? And that's what it's all about. So it doesn't have anything to do with the drugs. Nothing. It has to do with how you feel when there are no drugs. How you feel normally, in your own skin. That's addictive disease. That is what makes everybody in this room different from everybody else. Not the drugs, not the drug history, not the fact that your life was a mess at some point. But how you feel. All right, so let's start there. Now we go to the regular lecture. We have to start out at the point of recognizing that people differ from one another, that everybody is different, that if you take a whole population and scatter it about and measure them in some way, that they'll all fall on a curve. And the curve always looks like that, right? Where half the population is above, half the population is below, and you're all scattered under this hill. And as you're scattered under this hill, we could do this. We could measure how tall everybody in the room is. And some people would be up here, I'd be down there, and everybody else would be, somewhere in the middle, right? And we could do this with IQ. We could do this with heart rate. We could do it with blood pressure. However we do it, we're going to measure it, and it's going to be like this. One way that we can do it is by measuring the degree to which your brain responds to external stimulation, right? And one way of measuring that is through something that people have called stimulus augmentation or reduction. Here's what this means. Let's say I take a group of people and I expose them to a certain sound level, a certain volume, a certain level of of a single note, and then I turn it off, and I bring them back in 5 minutes later. I say, I want you to set the volume to where you think it was when you were previously exposed to it. Some people will set it much higher than it was originally. They thought it was much louder than it really was. Some people will set it much lower. People look at it in a different way. They experience it in a different way. You've all had that happen. You've gone to the movies with somebody or to a club with somebody, and somebody says, oh, why do they have to have the volume up so loud? And somebody else is going, oh, I think it's just fine. In fact, it could be a little louder. That would be great. So you go outside today. A lot of you probably went out for lunch, maybe took a little walk. It's bright out there. How many of you, if you were going to say walk down to the mall and back on a day like today, bright, sunny, blue sky day, how many of you would have worn sunglasses to do that walk? How many of you would not wear sunglasses to do the walk? And you see, we got about 50-50, right? Half of you were up here, you'd wear the sunglasses, right? And we'll call you sun positive. Half of you are down here. You would not wear the sunglasses. You'd be sun negative. Those of you who wore the sunglasses were essentially using a drug to adjust your conditions, right? A safe drug, not going to have any withdrawal, not going to have any intoxication. It's totally okay. But you were adjusting your experience using an external device. Why were you doing that? You were doing that because the world felt bright, irritating, annoying. And I'm willing to bet that those of you who absolutely have the sunglasses, who, have them on top of your head now, those of you out there are stimulus augmenters. You often feel as if the world is overly stimulating, annoying, distressing. You wish the volume would just get turned down. You wish the kids would stop yelling. You wish the guy across the street would quit mowing his lawn. And the dog would quit barking. And people would just get away, just stop. Right? That's a stimulus augmenter. Stimulus augmenter tends to like sedatives. Something that'll turn the volume down. They feel as if everything's just right when they can turn the volume down. Then down here we have the folks who don't even own sunglasses. World's a really quiet, mostly dull place. They're the ones who love going 90 in the left lane because everybody else is just going too slow. And you wouldn't mind hang gliding or skydiving or rock climbing or motorcycling, because something's got to turn the volume up a little bit. You want a loud club. Well, these are the folks for whom, methamphetamine, cocaine, right? Does the sunglass example work? Yeah. So for the most part it does, because for the most part it's pretty easy to divide people up and see what they're like and what they like and appreciate. But of course I can do this. This is kind of a parlor trick, right? I can do this with any population of people. Doesn't have to be addicts, but let's go on. Let's look at something else. Let's say that I want to know how drugs work. For how drugs work, we have to look at a timeline. It's over here on the horizontal line is time. And on the vertical line, we're going to use our 0 point, our baseline. That's our starting point. And we're just going to say 0. And then as drugs work, they usually do things to you. They might make you a little sedated. You might be a little disinhibited, doing things you wouldn't ordinarily do. Here you're sleepy. Here you're asleep. There you're dead. And right, direct result in the straight order of things as the brain becomes increasingly depressed. If you throw up right about there and get rid of what you took, then you don't die. If you don't throw up, right, that's on alcohol anyway, well then if you drank enough, you go down there. And similarly, up here, you're a little nervous, a little anxious, kind of bouncing around a bit, really uncomfortable, jittery, sweating, and somewhere in here you have a grand mal seizure. If I give you a sedative drug, and the sedative drug I'll use here for the sake of example, because it's been the best studied, is alcohol. But for alcohol, I can use all the equivalents. I can look at Valium, Librium, Ativan, Klonopin, Xanax. They're all the same, right? These are just really dry martinis. I can look at the Z drugs, so-called Z drugs because of what their generic names are, but their brand names are Sonata, Ambien, and Lunesta, all the same. I can look at Soma, the muscle relaxant. I can look at chloral hydrate. I can look at any one of these drugs. They all work identically. As far as the brain's concerned, they are the same drug, right? For those of you, I'm sure none of you have ever seen this, but have you ever heard of a doctor who would give somebody Klonopin during the day and Lunesta or Ambien in the evening? Right? I know none of you have ever seen that. That would be because it would be a ridiculous thing, right? You're giving them. It's like giving people a bud during the day and a Coors in the evening. It's sort of stupid. You don't mix them. And then just to beat all, some doctors out there, and I hope none of you have ever seen this, would give the Klonopin during the day and the Ambien at night, and then somewhere along the way an Adderall as well, right? No one would ever do that because that makes no sense. Why would you give somebody something that lifts you up and knocks you down simultaneously? Well, of course, there are speedballs. All right, I'm getting off the topic. All right, so So let's look just at alcohol and how it works. So alcohol, when you drink it, you experience a period that lasts about 2 hours long of sedation. The amplitude of this curve, the depth of the curve, is dependent upon how much alcohol I drink, not upon the time period, right? So the amplitude, this amount, the amount of sedation you experience, is based upon how much you drink. The 2 hour period, that's the same, independent of the amount. I can have a little bit, I can have a lot. It's going to last 2 hours, right? It may peak at a different point, right? If I drink a whole fifth of vodka all at once and I've had nothing to eat and I weigh 100 pounds, then yeah, I might end up dead as a result, okay? If I just drink a little tiny bit, I don't notice it, but it still lasts 2 hours and it's measurable. Okay. What do most people do when they drink? If you know how to drink, you space your drinks apart, right? And you space your drinks apart by, well, you want to get to a certain level first. Then you space them apart thereafter. Right? So if you want to space them apart just right, you're going to be drinking about the same amount steadily each hour. And that way, you maintain an identical level of sedation over an extended period of time. You know you can't have all the beer you want to have in an evening at once, or it doesn't work. But if you space the beers out, then it works well to maintain whatever the level is that you want to maintain over the course of the evening. But there's a part you don't count on, which is that each time this sedation wears off, the brain is in the position where the brain is saying to the body, what I mean for us to be doing is to be standing right here, exactly like this. And you just took a drug that made us go like that. I don't like that. And so I'm going to try and change the way I'm regulated so that we go back this way. The brain does that slowly over a period of time. And the alcohol wears off over that same period of time, and the brain overshoots. And so you end up over here. Then the brain says, I don't mean to be here either. Let's push you back toward the center. That takes a little while to do. And that leads to a different curve that looks like that. All right? So this is curve A here. That's curve B. Curve B is a lower amplitude. It's not as strong as the first one because it lasts longer, because the brain is rather slow at making these adjustments. So the first thing that happens when you drink alcohol is you feel sedated, disinhibited, calmed. The second thing that happens when that wears off is you get a little jittery, headache, discomfort, right? The light's too bright. It's annoying, right? You're back where you started from, but worse than that. And that's the hangover, all right? Now, if you drank just enough to notice something, you don't notice the curve B, right? You have to experience the sedation in order to experience the agitation that comes afterward. The best way to experience the agitation is to experience the sedation over an extended period of time, like this guy did. Right? He had 4 drinks, each one spaced an hour apart so that he could maintain his level of sedation way below where he normally is. And as a result, he gets 4 different B curves. And what happens there is the A's don't add up to each other because he said, I want to maintain the level of sedation. I know very well I can have a drink every hour in order to do that. But to maintain the level of agitation, you would have to drink only every 3 hours, but you spaced them more closely than that. So the agitations build up on each other to the point that the next morning, there it is, 4 in the morning, you're finally in bed, you finally get to sleep, and there you are. And you can't do it. Why can't you do it? Because you're here. And you're there saying to yourself, I wasn't that drunk last night. I shouldn't have this kind of issue. No, you weren't that drunk. but you were mildly intoxicated for an extended period of time. Now imagine the person who does this every day. Most of what they feel, most of their waking hours is this. They don't go back to where they started. They never give themselves a chance. They're here, they're grossly uncomfortable. Y'all know what'll make this person feel better right now, right? Drink. Brings you right back down. But just for a couple hours. Then you're going to be back up and even higher than you were to begin with. All right, so you've got these people with grave levels of discomfort the majority of the time. Right here. That's where they're living. Instead of living here where they originally were living. So if you're living in the wrong place, then think to yourself, remember, everything I just said here, none of this is about addictive disease. This is just pharmacology of sedatives. It applies to 100% of the mammalian population, right? Giraffes, bats, people, whatever, all the same. All right, take these folks, they come back, and they do it again and again and again, despite anything that might have happened along the way. This is addictive disease. The repeating process, the saying, no matter how uncomfortable it was, next time it'll be better. Next time it'll be different. I'll do it differently. I won't drink before noon. I won't drink this kind of thing. I won't drink in that sort of way. I won't drink in this and such a manner. Right? One of the best ways to diagnose addictive disease, it's funny, they teach new physicians all kinds of techniques to go through. There's a really easy way. All I need is for a patient to come in and say, yeah, doc, I don't have addiction because I only drink, I make sure to limit my drinks to 2. Okay, you have addictive disease. We're all done here. Because nobody who doesn't have addictive disease needs to limit their drinks. Right? I mean, does somebody come in and say, I limit the orange juice I have to only 2 glasses with my cereal? No. If anybody said that, I'd know they have a real problem with orange juice. No one has ever said that to me. So I look back at this and I say, this is interesting. Now let's take the first curve, the sunglass curve, and turn it on its side. All right? All of you who said, got to wear the sunglasses when I'm outside, you're starting out here. You are uncomfortable to begin with. For you, turning the volume down would be great. You're uncomfortable. Not ridiculously so. You can get through a day. You can do it. But you're uncomfortable. And the sunglasses turn things down. Alcohol works great. You have a glass of beer or a can of beer and you're all set. Makes you feel better. For the average person in the community, a can of beer makes them feel different, not better. Different. And for the people who are down here, those of you who said you're stimulus reducers, you don't even own sunglasses, the stimulants are the drugs you like. If you have a drug like alcohol, how does that make you feel? Worse, typically. Right? Uncomfortable, nauseated, sick to your stomach. It's not a good feeling. So if you start out down here, you don't like it. Well, now imagine you're up here, and you say to yourself, as most people who have addictive disease say, the very first time I tried X, I felt the way I think everybody else feels all the time. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's the disease. The fact is, you discovered the very first time you used that you felt better. And you were right. You did feel better. You went back to exactly where it was if you were stimulant and you started down here and go up. Same thing. And you suddenly discovered this is the way everybody else feels, usually. Yep, absolutely right. Problem is, you discovered it with a drug that has some side effects. And the side effects last longer than the effects. And so what happens is you do this, and then you go up here. And now, if you were uncomfortable to begin with, now you're up there, and you're damned uncomfortable. Well, this is a place where you can kind of go either way. You know the alcohol will make you feel better. You know the drug will make you feel better, but you don't need to do it. But up here, that's a different story. You need to do it. It's as if you were in that room with the food up here that you knew was poisonous, but you were so hungry and the hunger was driving you, and you said, my God, I'm sure there's some place in that food where the food doesn't have the poison sprayed in it. And that's where you are after you've used the drug for the first time, but not before. Before, you're just sitting there uncomfortable. So it takes three things in order to make somebody with addictive disease. The first thing it takes is that there's something that is causing you discomfort in the first place before you've ever been exposed to a drug. Something that makes you feel less than. Something that makes you feel like you're just not experiencing the world the way everybody else is. But then there's a second part, because remember, if I went out to the population that does not have addictive disease and I asked them about sunglasses or not, I'll find the same range. Right? There are a lot of folks out in the world who have stimulus augmentation and stimulus reduction and don't use drugs. They never discovered them. Or they discovered them and said, not for me, right? What's the difference? What is it that adds up to this? And for that, we have to talk about the fact that there is a contributing factor from genetics and a contributing factor from the environment. The genetics is this part. The part that says, here's how you feel at your baseline. Here's how you feel ordinarily. That's genetics. The environmental piece can be a little bit difficult. I apologize to those of you who heard this story before. It's still a good story, though, so I'll use the same one. 5-year-old kid's playing baseball for the first time. He goes out with his friends. He doesn't know how to play baseball. His friends know that, so they stick him in right field. Nothing happens in right field, right? Especially when you're 5 and the other kids playing are 6. Ball's never going to get there. And so the kid's out there, he's getting sunburned, he's counted the 4-leaf clover, he's watched the airplanes, he's named every cloud that he's seen. And then he sees a shadow and he hears a thunk. Well, there's the ball. Ball's way too big for his hand. He has no idea what to do with it or where it should go. And he looks up, everybody's yelling at him because the ball's been there for, like 10 seconds and he hasn't done anything yet. So he lifts up the ball. And he's got to throw it somewhere. And he sees some kid running. And he says, I'll throw it at the running kid. Everybody makes fun of him for not knowing how to play baseball. He goes home. He looks at his old man's dad. Everybody made fun of me. I feel like an idiot. I couldn't possibly get out of my own way any better. I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. Whatever it is he tells his old man. His dad looks at him and says, yeah, I think that exact same thing happened to me too. Let's get some ice cream. Then I'll take you out back and I'll show you how to play baseball so that you never get embarrassed like this again. Or he looks at him and says, well, gosh darn, Tommy, you pretty much suck at everything you do, don't you? Right? How many of you had that dad? Second dad, right? And second dad is the dad who just taught Tommy something. What he taught Tommy is, when I feel uncomfortable and ashamed and embarrassed and less than, and I share my feelings with someone who's supposed to give a damn, I will end up feeling worse. And so Tommy just learned not to do that, not to share his feelings, not to share intimately with other people. With girls, the story's usually a little different. You got molested in some way by stepbrother, stepdad, uncle, whatever. You go to mom, you tell her, mom hits you and says, never talk about that again. Or mom doesn't believe you, calls you a liar. Or mom says, yeah, that happens to all of us, but there's no other way we're going to keep a roof over our head. We just have to tolerate it. Suck it up. Right? You don't want to be like mom. So you grow up feeling less than, traumatized. Right? In some way, this trauma stays with you. Right? It's a tough question to answer. How many people have ever experienced something they would consider traumatizing in childhood, right? It's pretty much the whole room, right? That's routine for this disease. Something has to happen to trigger the genetic component so that you end up saying to yourself, the drugs make me feel better, nothing else does. Ordinary people, non-addicts, would typically say, drugs make me feel better, but so do a lot of other things. Therefore, I don't want to go down the road where I go to jail and I lose all my money and my home and my job and my family. Right? I'll simply do the road of talking to people. But I look at my folks, remember, any other chronic disease, if I had patients with diabetes, right, a life-threatening chronic disease that's eventually going to kill them, and I say to them, I can make it so that you can eat a normal diet, you can live a normal life, you're not going to have your toes falling off, you're not going to lose your eyesight. All you need to do is go into a room full of people who are other diabetics, say, hi, my name's Stu, I'm a diabetic, and let me explain what I went through last week, the difficulties I had with my insulin pump, or whatever it is, right? Well, they would jump up, they'd hug me, and they'd run to the next Diabetics Anonymous meeting. But I have my group of alcoholics who come in for the first time or addicts who come in for the first time, and I say to them, listen, I can make it so that you could have money in your pocket and your car will actually run and you'll have a job and a place to live and people who love and care about you. All you need to do is go into a room full of people just like you who have experienced the same sort of thing you did your whole childhood, growing up, your whole life, and share with them what you've gone through. Well, if they jump up and run off to the next AA meeting, I made a misdiagnosis. No one wants to do that, not if you've had this background, because you are certain that if you go into a room and share your feelings with people, a lot of people, let alone one person, that you're going to end up feeling worse, because that's always what happened to you before. It's been proven to you since you were 5. That's a tough thing to get over. Right? So the big part of addictive disease in terms of how we get through it is to get reparented. Right? What's Oxford House but being reparented? Right? People who are consistent. So doesn't mean they're your best friend. It means they're there for you like your parents are there for you, responsibly, consistently, appropriately, right? That's what the job is. And with that, you can get back to baseline, but with the recognition that baseline is not all better, because the genes are still there. You are back to the point where you started. You're uncomfortable, right? That's the baseline point that you've got, where the world is overpowering, overwhelming in some way, and you'd like to adjust it. How do you adjust it when you're in recovery? Well, one way of adjusting it is to use the coping mechanism as much as you can of talking with other people, of sharing with other people, of being there with other people, and using that skill as other people do. But remember, you're always going to know, it's always going to be in the back of your mind that there's a drug out there that will make me feel much better right now. Only problem is it'll destroy my life in the meantime and take me right back to that old path very quickly. I had a patient, airline pilot, who got into trouble overseas and went through the appropriate program as necessary under the federal regulations for airline pilots, and got himself cleaned up, went to a 28-day rehab, worked the program, went to AA every day, did everything he was supposed to do for a full 5 years. 5 years sober, 5 years recovery. The FAA finally said to him, all right, you're good to go. You may return to normal duties and all set. When you know, the next week, he's in jail after a bar brawl. And he came back in my office. I said, what happened? He said, well, I never really believed you. I knew I had to jump over the fence, jump over the hurdles that you'd set up for me, and I did all that because I'm good at all that. But I never honestly believed that I had something wrong with me. Well, how do you make somebody believe? How do you turn non-believers into believers when it's been pressured into them their whole life? You know, how all of this works. Anyway, I talked about how it takes 3 things to make somebody with addictive disease. One thing is you're born feeling a little uncomfortable. 2 is you grow up with the living system with the parents and so forth that make you feel less than, that make you feel as if there's no way of coping with the discomfort. The 3rd is you've got to grow up in a certain society, a society that promotes the use of substances. A society that says, here's what you're supposed to do when you turn 21. Here's what you're supposed to do at a wedding or a funeral or a wake or an anniversary or tailgating with your friends at a sports event or pretty much all the time, anytime. Here's what you're supposed to do. Apparently, we're supposed to change how we feel at those times. Right? That's what every TV show says. Anybody ever watch Grey's Anatomy or Scandal or any of those Thursday? Right. I mean, they drink all the time, right? More so than in real life, product placement at its best. And you sit there and say to yourself, why is it, we live in that kind of society? It's interesting. We have sort of a rule in our society that the goal is always take care of the minority. Right? We do that with seatbelts, right? We have a seatbelt law in every single state. The seatbelt law is there to protect the minority who would otherwise have been at some point in their life thrown through a windshield. Most of you won't end up getting thrown through a windshield. I'll tell you that right now. If none of you wear your seatbelts ever, most of you will end up okay. But a few of you wouldn't. In order to protect the few of you who wouldn't, all of us are willing to wear our seatbelts. That way, nobody ends up going through the windshield. Right? That's the way our society is set up for everything except drugs. With drugs, let's face it, most people can drink. Most people can even use marijuana. Most people can take opiates as prescribed. But a percentage cannot. Percentage cannot take those drugs without, going off on the racetrack here. In order to protect the minority, the 10 to 15% of the population whose lives end up destroyed, shouldn't the other 85% be willing to say, the hell with it? Right? But no one knows y'all exist. Right? It's in the back of their minds, even in the midst of a crisis, in part because of the anonymity. Right? And one of the things that I'm beginning to sort of toy with in my mind is the idea as to whether or not it's time to break the anonymity. Come on. Yeah. Right? Is it time for us to stand up as a group and say, nah, y'all need to listen to us now? Because we're going down a path, just like the pornography I talked about earlier, where things progress very rapidly to a group of people who really can't make the decisions properly for themselves. And unless we want the next generation to be in even worse shape than we've been, we've got to make some changes. And we can't make changes if no one hears us. Right? So it's interesting, breast cancer's out there with its pink ribbon. Everybody knows about the pink ribbon. I remember when I was a kid, you wouldn't talk about cancer. Doctors were even trained in how to not tell patients that they had cancer, right? So that they could just get treated and not have the anxiety of knowing that they might be dying, right? And, times have changed quite a bit, but we have no special color ribbon. There's no walk for addiction. There's not to the extent that we've got it in other areas. We need to sort of modify the paradigm and change things so that our culture stops being one that says that every single event has to be demarcated in some way with use of a mind-altering substance. Because if we didn't have that, if there were no drugs, then what we'd have is a group of people who would be a little uncomfortable and who wouldn't quite know how to feel better about it, But we could work on that. That would be pretty easy, right? If you came in feeling uncomfortable, but you still had money and a job and a family and at least some people who cared about you, wouldn't that be a better place to start than where we've had to start, right? So that's the goal, is how to get there. But I think Oxford House certainly goes a long way to putting you back in the place that you need to be. Hopefully this has done something for those of you who haven't heard me before, to sort of open the door to the different aspects of how to think about addictive disease. And remember, one of the reasons why medication-assisted treatment, going back to opiates for a second, one of the reasons why we look at that is that when we talk about the fact that there are these three separate reasons, three separate causes for addictive disease, we have to remember we can address all three of them. The trauma, the childhood part, we address with 12-step and with groups. The genetic component we haven't been able to deal with to date, but drugs like Suboxone start to be able to look at addressing that particular aspect of it. It's incomplete, but it is one aspect of it. The third aspect is public policy. You know, talking to your congressperson, talking to your senator, talking to your state legislature, and so forth. And the state legislatures have got to get out of the business of being medical doctors. Right? There is, and I'll sort of end with this section, there's no such thing as medical marijuana. None. No such thing. If there were medical marijuana, there would be a plant that would have been, you know, turned into a pill. It would have been FDA approved. It would have been shown to have efficacy for treatment of something. And we'd all be out there taking that for whatever it is we need. But there is no such thing. What there is are some components in the cannabis plant that are useful when broken down, when synthesized down, for a couple of extremely rare conditions, right? Not conditions that anybody in this room is likely to have, or anybody in any room with this number of people in it. I need way more people, and then maybe there's one person in there who might do well for it. So it's no surprise when I look at my own state, Rhode Island, and I see who's got the medical marijuana cards. It's not people who the insurance data demonstrate as having had a long history of some chronic illness. It's typically a group of 30-year-olds with no prior medical history except perhaps identified addictive disease who are coming in saying that they have pain or a hangnail or halitosis or something for which they need this, only this, not something that's been actually demonstrated to work, like a different shampoo. You know, it doesn't make sense. But we've got legislatures out there who are thinking to themselves in the different states that they went to medical school somewhere along the way, and they didn't. So they've called it medical marijuana, but you won't find anybody in the actual medical industry who's called it that, because there's no such thing. We've got legislated marijuana. And unfortunately, this is contributing to the country's belief system that intoxicants, things that change how you feel, are okay. Because indeed, they are okay for a majority. But there's a very significant minority for whom they are not. And it's for that minority that the rest of the country ought to be able to give it up. Yeah. And that's what we need to start asking for. Thanks very much. Good seeing you all. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.